In a world where we're constantly connected, where a single text can bridge any distance, how do you say goodbye to someone when words have never felt more inadequate? Sometimes the most profound moments happen in absolute silence, when two hearts understand what no language could ever express. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Ashford Manor, casting long shadows across the marble floors that had witnessed decades of both joy and sorrow. Catherine Sterling stood at the edge of the grand staircase, her fingers tracing the ornate banister that had supported countless hands before hers. Today felt different from all the other mornings she had descended these stairs. Today carried the weight of finality. William Ashford sat in his study, surrounded by leather-bound books and photographs that chronicled a life lived in service to others. His hands, usually steady from years of practiced composure, trembled slightly as he held a letter he had written and rewritten 17 times. The words on the paper seemed insufficient for what needed to be said, yet they were all he had. Neither of them knew that in just 3 hours, they would face a moment that would change everything they thought they understood about love, sacrifice, and the cruel mathematics of duty versus desire. Neither of them knew that this goodbye would happen without a single word being spoken, yet it would say everything that needed to be said. Catherine had always been different from the others in their social circle. While her peers focused on fashion and gossip, she spent her time volunteering at local hospitals, teaching literacy to underprivileged children, and quietly funding scholarship programs that bore no trace of her family name. Her authentic compassion wasn't something she wore like jewelry for others to admire. It was woven into the very fabric of who she was. She had met William 3 years ago at a charity gala for children's cancer research. While other attendees mingled with champagne flutes and practiced small talk, Catherine had slipped away to the hospital wing where some of the young patients were staying. William found her there, sitting cross-legged on the floor, reading stories to a group of children who had been too sick to attend the main event. "You're missing your own party," he had said, standing in the doorway. Catherine looked up, her eyes bright with the kind of joy that comes from meaningful connection. "No," she replied simply, "I think I found it." That moment had marked the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find. William, who had spent his entire life preparing to take over his family's extensive charitable foundation and estate, had never met someone who understood the weight of responsibility without being crushed by it. Catherine, who had grown up in the shadow of her family's business empire, had never met someone who chose service over personal gain at every turn. Their courtship had been unconventional. Instead of fancy dinners, they volunteered together at soup kitchens. Rather than attending exclusive parties, they spent evenings planning education initiatives for rural communities. They found love not in grand gestures, but in shared purpose and quiet moments of understanding. William's family had welcomed Catherine with genuine warmth. She brought lightness to their formal world without diminishing its dignity. She asked thoughtful questions about their foundation's work, offered innovative ideas for their programs, and never seemed intimidated by the centuries of tradition that surrounded everything they did. Catherine's family had been more complicated. Her father, Richard Sterling, had built a business empire through strategic acquisitions and ruthless efficiency. He respected William's family history and charitable work, but he also saw an opportunity for expansion. Marriage between the Sterling and Ashford families would create a powerful alliance that could benefit both their business interests and philanthropic reach. "Marriage is a partnership," Richard had told Catherine over dinner one evening. "The best partnerships benefit everyone involved." Catherine had nodded politely, but something in her father's tone had made her uncomfortable. She loved William deeply, but she also knew that their relationship existed in a complex web of expectations, traditions, and family obligations that neither of them had chosen. The first crack in their perfect world had appeared 6 months ago. Catherine's mother, Elizabeth, had been diagnosed with a rare form of brain cancer. The doctors at the local hospital had been honest about the prognosis, but Richard Sterling wasn't the type of man who accepted limitations. He had immediately begun researching treatment options around the world. The most promising experimental treatment was available at a research facility in Switzerland. The program was exclusive, expensive, and required a minimum commitment of 18 months. More importantly, it required the entire family to relocate during the treatment period to provide the necessary emotional support system. "We leave in 3 months," Richard had announced during a family meeting. "I've already begun the process of temporarily transferring business operations." Catherine's heart had dropped. 3 months. It seemed like both an eternity and No time at all. She looked around the room at her parents, her younger brother Marcus, and realized that this decision wasn't really a decision at all. Her mother needed this treatment. Her family needed to be together. Everything else, no matter how important it seemed, would have to wait. That night, she had called William. They met at their favorite spot in the manor's garden, beneath the ancient oak tree where they had shared their first kiss. How long? William had asked quietly. 18 months minimum, possibly longer, depending on how she responds to treatment. William had been silent for a long time, processing what this meant. 18 months apart, with no guarantee of when or if Catherine would return. His own responsibilities couldn't be paused or relocated. The Foundation's board was preparing to officially name him as the next director. There were commitments, projects, and people depending on his leadership. "We'll make it work," he had said finally. "Somehow, we'll make it work." But, as the weeks passed, they both began to understand that making it work was more complicated than either of them had imagined. The time difference between Switzerland and England would make regular communication difficult. Catherine's mother's treatment would be intensive and unpredictable, requiring Catherine's full attention and emotional energy. William's new role would demand complete focus and presence. They tried to plan for visits, but the logistics were daunting. Catherine's mother's treatment schedule was irregular, making it impossible to plan trips in advance. William's responsibilities included events, meetings, and commitments that had been scheduled months in advance and couldn't be rescheduled. Slowly, reluctantly, they began to face a truth that neither wanted to acknowledge. Sometimes love isn't enough to overcome circumstances. Sometimes the right thing to do for everyone involved means making choices that break your own heart. The night before Catherine's departure, they had dinner together at a small restaurant where they had celebrated their first anniversary. The conversation was stilted, filled with careful optimism and promises they both suspected they couldn't keep. "We'll write every day," Catherine had said. "I'll call whenever I can," William had replied. They both knew they were trying to convince themselves as much as each other. They both knew that maintaining a relationship across such distance, under such circumstances, would require a kind of emotional energy that they would need to dedicate to their respective families and responsibilities. Walking back to Catherine's family home that night, they had stopped under the same streetlight where William had first told her he loved her. The words hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. This might be goodbye in a way that neither of them was ready to accept. "Whatever happens," William had said, taking her hands in his, "I need you to know that these 3 years have been the best of my life. You've made me a better person, and nothing will ever change that." Catherine had nodded, unable to trust her voice. She knew he was giving her permission to let go if she needed to. She also knew he was telling her that their love was real and meaningful, even if it couldn't survive the circumstances they were facing. They had held each other under that streetlight until dawn began to creep across the sky, both trying to memorize the feeling of being completely understood and completely loved by another person. Now, as Catherine prepared for her final morning at Ashford Manor, she carried that memory with her. William had invited her family for breakfast before their departure to Switzerland. It was meant to be a proper farewell, a chance for both families to express their hopes for Elizabeth's recovery and their confidence in Catherine and William's relationship. But Catherine knew, as she stood at the top of those grand stairs, that this breakfast would really be something else entirely. It would be the moment when they both had to choose between holding on and letting go. It would be the moment when love would have to prove whether it was strong enough to survive an indefinite separation or honest enough to acknowledge when circumstances made continuation impossible. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times. In 30 minutes, both families would gather in the morning room for what everyone would politely call a farewell breakfast. Catherine took one last look around the space that had become like a second home to her, breathed deeply, and began her descent down the stairs toward whatever came next. The morning room at Ashford Manor had always been Catherine's favorite space in the house. Unlike the formal dining room with its imposing chandelier and ancestral portraits, this room felt warm and lived in. Sunlight streamed through French doors that opened onto the garden, and the walls were lined with bookshelves filled with well-worn volumes that showed evidence of being actually read, not just displayed. William's mother, Eleanor Ashford, had set the table herself that morning, choosing the simple blue and white china that the family used for everyday meals rather than the formal settings reserved for special occasions. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that this breakfast needed to feel like a continuation of the comfortable intimacy Catherine had shared with their family, not like a ceremonial ending. Catherine arrived with her parents and her younger brother Marcus at exactly 8:30. Her mother, Elizabeth, looked fragile but determined. The past months of medical consultations and treatment preparations had taken a visible toll, but she carried herself with the dignity that Catherine had inherited. She wore a soft lavender dress that brought color back to her pale complexion, and she had insisted on doing her own hair and makeup despite her family's offers to help. Richard Sterling shook hands with William's father, James Ashford, with the firm grip of a man accustomed to sealing important deals. But there was something different in his manner this morning. The usual calculating edge was softened by genuine gratitude for the Ashford family's support during Elizabeth's diagnosis and the complex weeks of treatment planning. Marcus, 19, and usually uncomfortable in formal settings, seemed unusually subdued. He had grown close to William over the past 3 years, finding in him the kind of older brother figure he had never had. William had taught him to drive, helped him with his university applications, and spent countless hours listening to his concerns about their mother's illness with patience and wisdom that surprised Marcus. William stood near the window, ostensibly checking the weather but really watching Catherine's reflection in the glass as she spoke quietly with his mother. He had barely slept the night before, alternating between rehearsing things he wanted to say and acknowledging that there might be nothing left to say that would make any of this easier. Eleanor guided everyone to the table with the graceful efficiency that came from decades of hosting important gatherings. She had planned the menu carefully: Elizabeth's favorite lemon scones, fresh fruit from their own garden, the particular blend of tea that Catherine preferred, and small portions of everything so that people could focus on conversation rather than eating. The first part of breakfast proceeded with the kind of careful normalcy that characterized difficult conversations. James asked about the logistics of the move to Switzerland, offering practical advice about international banking and shipping. Eleanor shared the name of a friend who lived near the treatment facility and could help with local recommendations. Marcus described his plans for his gap year, during which he would help care for their mother and continue his studies remotely. Catherine participated in the conversation, but William noticed that she kept glancing toward the garden, as if she were trying to memorize details she might forget. He knew that feeling. For the past week, he had found himself taking mental photographs of ordinary moments. Catherine laughing at something his mother said, Catherine reading in his study, Catherine absently humming while she helped arrange flowers. The doctors are very optimistic, Elizabeth said, addressing the table but looking specifically at William. The treatment has shown remarkable success in similar cases. We expect to be back home before you know it. William nodded and smiled, but he caught the slight emphasis Elizabeth placed on the word we. She was including Catherine in that return, making it clear that she expected her daughter to come home with the family when the treatment was complete. It wasn't a criticism or a demand, but it was a reality that everyone at the table understood. Of course, William replied. And we'll be here, ready to celebrate your recovery. The conversation continued, touching on lighter topics: plans for the garden renovation that would be complete by the time they returned, upcoming foundation events that Catherine would unfortunately miss, mutual friends who had asked to be remembered to the family. Everyone was working hard to maintain the illusion that this was a temporary separation with a clear endpoint. Catherine found herself studying the faces around the table, trying to understand how it was possible to love people so much that letting go of them felt like letting go of part of herself. Her parents needed her support during the most frightening period of their lives. Marcus, despite his maturity, was still struggling with the reality of their mother's illness and would need his sister's strength. William's family had welcomed her so completely that leaving felt like abandoning people who had become as important to her as her own relatives. But then there was William himself, sitting across from her with that slight crease between his eyebrows that appeared whenever he was thinking deeply about something. She knew that expression as well as she knew her own reflection. She knew the way he drummed his fingers silently against his leg when he was nervous, the way he tilted his head slightly when he was really listening to someone, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about a new project or idea. 18 months. It sounded manageable when spoken aloud, but Catherine had learned enough about her mother's condition to know that 18 months was the minimum estimate. The treatment could take longer. Recovery could be slower than expected. Complications could arise that would extend their stay indefinitely. Even in the best-case scenario, 18 months was enough time for two people to become strangers to each other. 18 months of different experiences, different challenges, different growth. 18 months of learning to live separate lives, to make decisions independently, to find strength and comfort in other people and other places. William was thinking along similar lines. His new role as director of the Ashford Foundation would require complete dedication, especially in the first year. There would be late nights, weekend events, travel to visit projects around the world. He would meet new people, face new challenges, and gradually become someone slightly different from the person Catherine knew. He glanced at his parents, who were listening attentively to Richard Sterling's description of the Swiss medical facility. They had been married for 32 years, and their relationship had survived career demands, health scares, the pressures of managing a large estate, and the normal evolution that comes with decades of shared life. But they had never faced the kind of prolonged separation that he and Catherine were contemplating. "How do you do it?" he had asked his father the week before. "How do you maintain a relationship when circumstances try to pull you apart?" James had considered the question seriously before answering. "Honestly, you don't maintain relationships, son. Relationships aren't static things that you preserve unchanged. They're living connections that either grow stronger through challenges or grow apart because of them. The key is making sure both people are committed to growing in the same direction." The memory of that conversation made William look across the table at Catherine with new clarity. They were both about to face challenges that would change them in ways they couldn't predict. The question wasn't whether they could maintain their current relationship across time and distance. The question was whether they could trust each other to grow in ways that would allow them to find each other again when the circumstances changed. As breakfast progressed, the conversation gradually shifted toward practical matters. Flight times, contact information, medication schedules, and the dozens of small details that accompany any major life transition. Catherine's family would fly to Geneva that afternoon, then drive to the treatment facility the following morning. "We should probably start loading the cars soon," Richard said, checking his watch. "The airport security has been more stringent lately, and we want to allow plenty of time." Eleanor immediately stood to begin wrapping leftover scones for the family to take with them. "Elizabeth, dear, make sure you eat something on the plane. The airline food is terrible, and you need to keep your strength up." The moment everyone had been avoiding was suddenly upon them. The careful normalcy of breakfast was giving way to the reality of departure preparations. Catherine felt her chest tighten as she realized that the next few minutes would likely be her last time in this room that had come to feel like home. William excused himself to get something from his study. He returned carrying a small wrapped package that he handed to Marcus. "For your mother," he said quietly. "It's a book of photography from the English countryside. I thought she might enjoy looking at familiar landscapes while she's away." Marcus accepted the gift with surprising grace for a 19-year-old who usually struggled with emotional moments. "Thank you for everything. You've been—" He paused, searching for words. "You've been really important to our family." William shook hands with Richard, who surprised everyone by pulling him into a brief, firm hug. "Take care of yourself, son. We'll see you soon." Elizabeth approached William with the careful movements of someone conserving energy for a long journey ahead. She took his hands in both of hers and looked directly into his eyes. "Thank you for loving my daughter," she said simply. "Whatever happens next, I want you to know how grateful I am for the happiness you've brought to her life." William felt his throat tighten. "Mrs. Sterling, it has been my privilege. Catherine is the most remarkable person I've ever known." Elizabeth nodded and squeezed his hands once before releasing them. She understood, perhaps better than anyone else, the weight of the goodbye that was about to happen between her daughter and William. Eleanor and James embraced Catherine with the warmth they had shown her from their first meeting. "You'll always be family here," Eleanor whispered. "Distance doesn't change that." And then, suddenly, it was just Catherine and William standing in the morning room while their families moved toward the front door with luggage and final preparations. The space that had felt warm and intimate moments before now felt vast and charged with everything they hadn't said to each other. They stood there for a moment, neither moving nor speaking, both understanding that whatever happened next would determine how they remembered this moment for the rest of their lives. The silence between Catherine and William stretched like a held breath. Through the French doors, they could hear the distant sounds of car doors closing and luggage being arranged, but inside the morning room, time seemed suspended. The grandfather clock in the hallway had stopped its ticking, as if even time understood that this moment needed to exist outside its normal measurements. Catherine stood near the bookshelf, her fingers absently tracing the spine of a volume of poetry that William had given her for her birthday. She had been reading it just yesterday, marking passages that reminded her of conversations they had shared. Now the book felt like an artifact from a different life, something she would need to leave behind along with everything else that belonged to this version of herself. William remained by the window, but his reflection showed Catherine that he was watching her rather than looking outside. She could see in his face the same struggle she felt, the desperate desire to say something meaningful, warring with the knowledge that words might only make this harder than it already was. "Catherine," her father's voice called from the front hall. "We need to leave in 5 minutes. 5 minutes to end 3 years. 5 minutes to say goodbye to a future they had both imagined and planned for. 5 minutes to transform from lovers to memories." "I should go," Catherine said, but she didn't move toward the door. "Yes," William agreed, but he took a step closer to her instead of toward the hallway. They found themselves standing in the center of the room, close enough to touch, but not touching, both afraid that physical contact would shatter whatever fragile control they had maintained throughout breakfast. Catherine looked up at William's face, trying to memorize details she thought she already knew by heart. The small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident, the way his eyes changed color depending on the light, the expression of intense concentration he wore when he was trying not to let emotion overwhelm him. "I wrote you a letter," William said quietly, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "I tried to say everything I wanted you to know, but—" He held the letter for a moment, then set it on the table nearby. "Maybe words aren't what matter right now." Catherine nodded, understanding. They had talked extensively over the past weeks about their feelings, their hopes, their fears about the separation. They had analyzed and planned and promised and worried. But all those words had brought them to this moment of silence, where what passed between them felt more honest than anything they had said aloud. She reached into her purse and withdrew a small wrapped box. "I was going to give this to you last night, but it didn't feel like the right moment. I don't think there is a right moment for something like this." William accepted the box, but didn't open it. They both understood that these were tokens for later, for moments when they would need something tangible to hold on to. Opening them now would feel like an ending, and neither of them was ready for endings. "Catherine," Marcus's voice carried an edge of anxiety. Their parents were probably already in the car, waiting with the kind of patience that comes from understanding the importance of what their daughter needed to do, but knowing they couldn't delay their departure indefinitely. "I have to go," Catherine said, and this time her voice carried the finality that had been missing before. "I know." They stood looking at each other for another moment, and Catherine realized that this was the moment she would remember most clearly. Not their first meeting, not their first kiss, not any of the celebrations or romantic gestures or significant conversations they had shared. This moment of absolute understanding and absolute powerlessness would be what she carried with her. William reached out and touched her face, his palm warm against her cheek. Catherine closed her eyes and leaned into the contact, feeling the weight of everything they were about to lose and everything they had been grateful to find. When she opened her eyes, she saw that William was crying. Not the dramatic sobbing of movie scenes, but the quiet tears that come when grief is too deep for sound. Without thinking, she reached up and brushed the tears away with her thumb, the gesture so automatic and intimate that it spoke to the thousands of small caretaking moments that had defined their relationship. "Don't," she whispered, though she was crying too now. "If we start really crying, I won't be able to leave, and I have to leave." William nodded and stepped back, recognizing the truth in what she said. If they allowed themselves to fully feel the magnitude of this goodbye, it would become impossible to function. They both had responsibilities that required them to be strong, clear-headed, and focused on other people's needs. "Catherine, sweetheart, I'm so sorry, but we really must go now." Eleanor Ashford's voice carried from the doorway. She had come to help with the transition, understanding that sometimes the hardest goodbyes need assistance from people who love you enough to make the impossible possible. Catherine looked at William one more time, trying to communicate everything she couldn't say, that she loved him completely, that leaving was the hardest thing she had ever done, that she hoped somehow they would find their way back to each other, that she would carry the best parts of their relationship with her wherever she went. William looked back at her with the same intensity, and she understood his response, that he loved her enough to let her go, that he would rather have their relationship end in love than let it deteriorate through impossible circumstances, that he would remember her exactly as she was in this moment, that he trusted her to take care of herself and her family. All of this passed between them in seconds, an entire conversation conducted through eye contact, the kind of understanding that develops between people who have truly seen each other. Then, Catherine turned and walked toward the door. She didn't look back, not because she didn't want to, but because she knew that if she saw William's face again, she would run back to him and make this impossibly harder for both of them. Eleanor fell into step beside her as they walked toward the front hall. "You're doing the right thing," she said quietly. "It takes tremendous courage to choose what's best for everyone when it's painful for yourself." Catherine nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The front door was open, and she could see her family's car in the circular drive, engine running and luggage secured. Her father stood beside the passenger door, checking his watch but trying not to appear impatient. Her mother sat in the front seat, looking pale but determined. Marcus waited by the back door, holding it open for his sister. The transition from the house to the car happened quickly, as if everyone understood that prolonging it would make it more difficult. Catherine slipped into the back seat beside Marcus, who immediately took her hand and squeezed it tightly. Her parents made brief but warm farewells to Eleanor and James, with promises to stay in touch and updates about Elizabeth's treatment progress. As the car began to move down the long drive, Catherine allowed herself one glance back at Ashford Manor. William stood in the doorway with his parents, and even from this distance, she could see that he was watching the car. She lifted her hand in a small wave and saw him raise his in response. Then, the car turned at the end of the drive, and the manor disappeared behind the trees. The drive to the airport passed in relative silence. Elizabeth dozed fitfully against the window, exhausted by the emotional strain of saying goodbye to the life she had built in England. Richard focused on driving with the concentrated attention he always brought to difficult tasks. Marcus stared out his window, processing his own complex feelings about leaving the country where he had planned to attend university. Catherine sat quietly, feeling the weight of the small wrapped box in her purse and thinking about the letter William had left for her. She would read it later, when she had privacy to cry if she needed to. Right now, she needed to be present for her family's needs and her own necessity to function through the practical demands of international travel. But, as the familiar landscape of her childhood rolled past the car windows, Catherine found herself thinking not about what she was leaving behind, but about what lay ahead. Her mother's treatment would be challenging, but the doctors were genuinely optimistic. Marcus would have the opportunity to see a different part of the world and gain perspectives that would serve him well in his future studies. Her father, for all his business focus, was showing a tenderness and vulnerability in caring for his wife that reminded Catherine why her parents' marriage had lasted 25 years. And she herself would have the chance to discover who she was when removed from the comfortable patterns of her established life. She had never lived anywhere but England, never faced a major crisis, never had to be the primary source of strength for her family during a genuinely frightening time. The irony wasn't lost on her that in leaving William to care for her family, she was demonstrating exactly the qualities that had made him fall in love with her in the first place. Her capacity for selfless service, her ability to make difficult decisions based on what was right rather than what was easy, her willingness to sacrifice her own immediate happiness for the welfare of people who needed her. Perhaps that understanding was what would allow her to carry their love forward in a positive way, regardless of whether they ever found their way back to each other romantically. The best parts of what they had shared would become part of who she was, and how she approached the challenges ahead. As the airport came into view, Catherine felt something shift inside her chest. The acute pain of leaving was beginning to transform into something else: determination, purpose, and a quiet confidence that she could handle whatever came next. She still loved William completely, and she still wished circumstances were different, but she no longer felt like she was being pulled apart by competing loyalties. She was making a choice that honored everyone she loved, including herself. That realization didn't make the goodbye hurt less, but it made the pain feel meaningful rather than senseless. The car pulled up to the departure terminal, and Catherine took a deep breath as her family began the familiar routine of international travel, checking tickets, organizing passports, managing luggage, and navigating the cheerful chaos of an airport. In just a few hours, she would be in a different country, beginning a completely different chapter of her life. But she would carry with her the memory of William's hand on her face, the understanding that had passed between them without words, and the knowledge that some kinds of love are strong enough to survive anything. Even goodbye. 3 months after the goodbye that changed everything, William sat in his study at Ashford Manor, holding Catherine's unopened letter in one hand and his phone in the other. The letter had arrived that morning, forwarded through a complex chain of international mail services, and her handwriting on the envelope was both achingly familiar and somehow foreign after months of separation. He had been staring at it for 20 minutes, unable to decide whether opening it would bring comfort or make the constant, low-level ache of missing her sharper and more unbearable. In those 3 months, their communication had been exactly what they had both predicted it would be: sporadic, carefully optimistic, and increasingly focused on practical updates rather than personal feelings. Catherine's mother was responding well to treatment, but slowly. The experimental therapy was promising, but it required frequent adjustments and careful monitoring that made Elizabeth's schedule unpredictable from week to week. Catherine had thrown herself into supporting her family with the same complete dedication she had once brought to their relationship, and her emails reflected that focus. Marcus was thriving in Switzerland, learning German and French while continuing his studies remotely. He had made friends among the other families dealing with similar medical situations, and his natural resilience was helping him adapt to their temporary life abroad. Catherine wrote about his progress with pride and relief, knowing that his adjustment made their mother's treatment less stressful for everyone. Richard had surprised everyone by taking a genuine interest in the medical research being conducted at the facility. His business mind had identified several opportunities to support the clinic's work, and he was exploring ways to fund expansion of the treatment program. Catherine mentioned this development with obvious admiration for her father's capacity to find constructive purpose even in difficult circumstances. What she didn't write about, William noticed, was herself. Her letters contained no complaints, no expressions of loneliness or difficulty, no acknowledgement of the personal sacrifice she was making. Either she was protecting him from worry about her well-being, or she was protecting herself from acknowledging feelings that would make her situation harder to bear. William's own life had evolved in ways that both surprised and concerned him. Taking over as director of the Ashford Foundation had been more challenging and more rewarding than he had expected. The work demanded complete attention, frequent travel, and the kind of strategic thinking that left little mental energy for personal reflection. He had thrown himself into foundation projects with an intensity that his parents watched with a mixture of pride and worry. In 3 months, he had overseen the launch of 2 new scholarship programs, negotiated partnerships with 3 international development organizations, and personally visited project sites in 4 different countries. "You're doing excellent work," his father had said the week before, "but you're also working like someone who's trying to outrun something." James was right, William acknowledged. He was trying to outrun the persistent feeling that he was living half a life, that every achievement felt somehow incomplete because Catherine wasn't there to share it with him. He had thought that staying busy would help him adjust to her absence, but instead it seemed to highlight how much their shared purpose had meant to him. The foundation work was fulfilling in its own right, but it lacked the deeper meaning that had come from planning projects together, from seeing Catherine's face light up when they solved a problem or helped someone in need. He found himself automatically looking for her in crowded rooms at charity events, or reaching for his phone to share interesting developments with her before remembering that their communication now required careful consideration and international time zones. His phone buzzed with a text message, interrupting his contemplation of Catherine's letter. It was from Sarah Mitchell, a program coordinator he had been working with on a new education initiative in Kenya. Sarah was intelligent, dedicated, and genuinely committed to the Foundation's mission. She was also clearly interested in William personally, though she had been tactful enough not to express that interest directly. "Dinner meeting tomorrow to discuss the Nairobi proposal? I have some ideas for the funding structure that might interest you." William stared at the message for a moment, recognizing it for what it was: an opportunity to begin moving forward with his life in a way that didn't center on waiting for Catherine's return. Sarah was exactly the kind of person he should be spending time with, someone who shared his professional interests, understood his responsibilities, and was available to build something new together. The thought made him feel simultaneously grateful for the possibility and guilty for considering it. He and Catherine had never discussed what would happen if their separation extended beyond the initial 18-month estimate. They had never explicitly agreed to wait for each other, but they had never agreed not to wait either. William set down his phone without responding to Sarah's message and, finally, opened Catherine's letter. Her handwriting filled 2 pages with an update about her mother's latest test results, Marcus's language studies, and her father's growing involvement with the medical center's research programs. But On the second page, she had written something more personal. William, I hope you won't mind my asking, but how are you really doing? Your letters are full of foundation news and project updates, which makes me incredibly proud of everything you're accomplishing. But I realize I don't know how you're handling the daily reality of this separation, and I worry that we're both being so careful not to burden each other that we're not being honest about our own struggles. I miss you constantly, not just the big moments we used to share, but the small ones. Having coffee together in the morning, discussing something interesting I read, hearing your perspective on a decision I need to make. I find myself composing conversations with you in my head, and sometimes I forget for a moment that you're not actually here to respond. At the same time, I'm discovering things about myself that I might never have learned if circumstances hadn't forced me to be more independent. I'm stronger than I thought I was, more resilient, more capable of being a source of strength for other people without losing myself in the process. I don't know if that makes this separation worthwhile, but it does make it feel like something other than just loss. I don't want you to wait for me if waiting is preventing you from building a fulfilling life. I also don't want you to feel pressured to move on if you're not ready. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that I trust you to make the decisions that are right for you, and I hope you know that whatever those decisions are, they won't change what we meant to each other. All my love, Catherine. William read the letter 3 times, feeling something loosen in his chest that had been tight since the morning she left. Catherine's honesty about missing him gave him permission to acknowledge his own loneliness without feeling like he was being unfair to her circumstances. Her recognition of her own growth reminded him that separation, however painful, didn't have to be only destructive. Most importantly, her explicit acknowledgement that they both needed to make decisions based on their current reality rather than their shared past gave him the clarity he had been seeking without knowing it. He picked up his phone and responded to Sarah's text. Dinner sounds perfect. Looking forward to hearing your ideas. Then, he sat down and wrote Catherine the most honest letter he had sent since she left. Catherine, thank you for your honesty about how you're really doing. It gives me permission to admit that I miss you in ways that surprise me every day. I miss your voice, your laugh, the way you think through problems, the way you make everything more interesting just by being present for it. You're right that I've been focusing on work as a way of managing the separation. The foundation projects are genuinely fulfilling, but they also provide a structure that helps me function without constantly thinking about what's missing from my life. I've been wondering lately whether I'm waiting for you to return or waiting for this feeling of incompleteness to fade. Your letter helps me understand that maybe those aren't the only 2 options. Maybe there's a third possibility, learning to build a full and meaningful life while carrying our relationship as a beautiful part of my story, regardless of whether it continues romantically. I'm going to start making decisions based on what feels right for my life now, rather than what preserves the possibility of our future together. That feels both frightening and liberating. I hope you're doing the same thing. I love you completely, and I always will. But I think I'm finally ready to love other things completely too, without feeling like that diminishes what we shared. Always yours, William. He sealed the letter and set it aside to mail the next day. Then, he opened his laptop and began preparing for his dinner with Sarah, feeling lighter than he had in months. The next evening, William found himself genuinely enjoying Sarah's company in a way that had nothing to do with comparing her to Catherine. Sarah's ideas for the Kenya project were innovative and practical, but more than that, she brought an energy and enthusiasm to their work that reminded him why he had been drawn to foundation work in the first place. You know, Sarah said over dessert, I've been wondering if you'd be interested in visiting the Nairobi site together next month. I think seeing the community firsthand would help us refine our approach. William considered the invitation, recognizing it as both a professional opportunity and a personal one. 6 months ago, the idea of traveling anywhere with someone other than Catherine would have felt like a betrayal. Tonight, it felt like a step toward building the kind of rich, purposeful life that Catherine herself had encouraged him to pursue. I think that's an excellent idea, he said, and meant it. Meanwhile, in Switzerland, Catherine sat by her mother's bedside in the medical facility, reading aloud from a novel they were enjoying together. Elizabeth's latest treatment cycle was going well, but the doctors had suggested that recovery might take longer than originally estimated. Rather than 18 months, they were now looking at a timeline of 2 to 3 years for complete treatment and rehabilitation. Catherine had received William's letter that morning and had spent the day thinking about his words. His honesty about beginning to move forward with his life brought her relief rather than pain, which surprised her. She realized she had been carrying worry about whether he was limiting his own growth out of loyalty to their relationship, and his letter freed her from that concern. "You seem thoughtful today," Elizabeth said when Catherine finished the chapter. "Good news or difficult news?" "Both, I think," Catherine replied. "William wrote to tell me that he's beginning to make decisions based on his current life rather than our past relationship. It makes me sad, but it also makes me proud of him." Elizabeth reached for her daughter's hand. "Darling, do you think it's possible that your relationship with William was never meant to last forever, but was meant to teach you both something important about love and commitment?" Catherine considered this. "What do you mean?" "I mean that maybe the love you shared was preparation for the people you're becoming now. William is learning to channel his capacity for devotion into work that serves others. You're learning to be strong and independent while still being deeply caring. Those are gifts you gave each other that you'll carry into whatever comes next." That evening, Catherine walked alone through the small Swiss town near the medical facility. The streets were quiet and beautifully lit, and she found herself thinking about her mother's words. The pain of missing William was still real, but it was beginning to feel like a different kind of pain, not the sharp agony of fresh loss, but the deeper ache of profound gratitude for something beautiful that had changed her forever. She thought about the person she had been 3 years ago when she first met William, and the person she was becoming now. The love they had shared had taught her that she was capable of complete commitment without losing herself, that she could make difficult decisions based on principle rather than convenience, that she could carry strength and gentleness simultaneously. Whatever happened next in her life, those lessons would remain with her. And whatever happened in William's life, she hoped he was learning similar things about his own capacity for love, leadership, and meaningful contribution to the world. As she walked back toward the medical facility where her mother was sleeping peacefully, Catherine felt something she hadn't expected to feel: excitement about the future. Not because she had stopped loving William or stopped missing what they had shared, but because she was beginning to understand that their relationship had prepared her to love other people and other purposes with the same depth and authenticity. For the first time since leaving England, Catherine allowed herself to wonder what that future might look like. 2 years and 3 months after that silent goodbye in the morning room of Ashford Manor, Catherine stood in the departure lounge of Geneva Airport, waiting for a flight that would take her home to England. Her mother sat beside her, healthy and vibrant, reading a magazine with the casual contentment of someone who had learned not to take ordinary moments for granted. Marcus dozed in a nearby chair, exhausted from the previous day's celebration of their mother's clean bill of health and official treatment completion. The experimental therapy had been more successful than anyone had dared to hope. Elizabeth Sterling was not only cancer-free, but stronger and more energetic than she had been before her diagnosis. The months of treatment had been difficult, but they had also brought the family closer together and given all of them a deeper appreciation for the preciousness of health, time, and shared experiences. Catherine's reflection in the airport window showed her a person she almost didn't recognize from the woman who had left England more than 2 years before. Her face was thinner, more defined by the kind of quiet confidence that comes from surviving genuine hardship. Her eyes held a depth that spoke of experiences that had tested and strengthened her in ways she couldn't have imagined. The time in Switzerland had transformed her in unexpected ways. Initially focused entirely on supporting her family, she had gradually begun to engage with the international community surrounding the medical facility. Her natural empathy and organizational skills had made her invaluable to other families navigating similar medical journeys. And within a year, she had become an unofficial coordinator for the facility's family support services. The work had been emotionally demanding, but deeply fulfilling. Catherine discovered that she had a talent for helping people find hope and practical solutions during their most frightening and uncertain periods. She had learned to speak conversational German and French, developed expertise in medical advocacy, and created support systems that the facility had formally adopted as part of their standard patient care. Dr. Andreas Weber, the facility's chief of family services, had offered her a permanent position just the week before. "Catherine," he had said, "you have a gift for this work that we rarely see. If you're interested, we would be honored to have you lead our international family support program." The offer had been tempting in ways that surprised her. She had found genuine purpose in the work, formed meaningful friendships with colleagues and other families, and built a life in Switzerland that felt rich and independent. For the first time since adolescence, she had discovered who she was when removed from the expectations and patterns of her established social circle. But she had also been honest with Dr. Weber about her uncertainty. "I need to go home first," she had told him. "I need to see my old life with new eyes before I decide where I belong." The flight boarding announcement interrupted her thoughts, and Catherine gathered her belongings with the strange mixture of excitement and nervousness that comes with major transitions. She was eager to see England again, to reconnect with friends and places she had missed, to show her family the life she had built before their departure. She was also aware that returning home meant facing the question of William directly for the first time in more than a year. Their correspondence had gradually shifted over the months from personal letters to occasional updates about major life events. Catherine knew that he had traveled extensively for foundation work, that he had been promoted to international director, and that he had been recognized for innovative approaches to educational development in sub-Saharan Africa. What she didn't know was whether he was in a relationship, whether he had thought about her during their long separation, or what it would be like to see him again after becoming such different people from who they had been when they said goodbye. The flight to London passed quickly, with Catherine alternating between reading and looking out the window as familiar landscapes came into view. Marcus slept most of the way, recovering from the emotional intensity of leaving Switzerland after 2 years. Elizabeth spent the flight writing in a journal she had started during treatment, documenting her thoughts about returning to a life that had been interrupted but not destroyed. Richard Sterling met them at Heathrow Airport with a car and driver, looking more relaxed than Catherine could remember seeing him. The success of his wife's treatment and his growing involvement with medical research had given him a sense of purpose beyond business expansion, and the change was visible in everything from his posture to the way he smiled at airport crowds that would once have made him impatient. The drive through London toward their family home felt surreal to Catherine. Everything looked both exactly the same and somehow smaller than she remembered. The streets she had known since childhood seemed narrower, the buildings less imposing, the entire city more manageable than it had felt when she lived there. "It's strange," she told her mother quietly. "I thought I would feel immediately at home, but instead I feel like a tourist in my own life." Elizabeth nodded knowingly. "That's normal after such a long time away. Give yourself a few weeks to readjust. Some things will feel familiar again, and others will feel permanently different because you've changed." Their family home had been maintained perfectly in their absence, but it felt oddly formal to Catherine after 2 years of living in modest temporary housing. The rooms seemed too large, the furniture too elaborate, the overall atmosphere too carefully preserved. She realized that she had grown accustomed to a simpler, more functional way of living that prioritized relationships and experiences over material surroundings. That evening, after her family had settled into the comfort of being home, Catherine found herself walking alone through the neighborhood where she had grown up. She passed the cafe where she and William used to meet for coffee, the bookstore where they had spent countless Saturday afternoons, the small park where they had often walked after dinner. Each location brought back vivid memories, but they felt like memories of a different person's life. The woman who had shared those experiences with William had been loving and thoughtful, but she had also been someone who defined herself largely in relation to other people's expectations. The woman walking these streets now had learned to find purpose and identity independent of romantic relationships or family obligations. 2 days later, Catherine received a text message that made her heart race. "I heard you were back in England. Would you like to meet for coffee? No pressure if you'd rather not." "William," she stared at the message for 10 minutes before responding. "I'd like that very much. The usual place tomorrow at 2. "Perfect. Looking forward to seeing you." Catherine spent the rest of the day alternating between excitement and terror about seeing William again. She tried on half a dozen outfits before settling on something simple that felt authentically like the person she had become rather than the person she had been. She practiced conversations in her head, then abandoned all preparation and decided to simply be present for whatever happened naturally. The next afternoon, she arrived at their old cafe 5 minutes early and chose a table near the window where they used to sit. At exactly 2 o'clock, she saw William walking down the street toward the cafe, and her breath caught in her throat. He looked older, more substantial, with the kind of confident bearing that comes from successfully handling significant responsibilities. His hair was shorter, his clothes more formal, and there was something in his posture that suggested he had grown comfortable with being a leader rather than someone preparing to become a leader. When he entered the cafe and saw her, his face broke into the warm, genuine smile she remembered from their best moments together. But there was something different in his expression too, affection without desperation, pleasure without pain. The look of someone genuinely happy to see an important person from his past without needing that person to complete his present. "Catherine," he said, approaching her table. "You look wonderful. Really wonderful." They embraced briefly, and Catherine was surprised by how natural it felt. There was no awkwardness, no overwhelming surge of old feelings, just the warm recognition between two people who had loved each other deeply and were genuinely glad to reconnect. "You look like someone who's been doing important work," she said as they sat down. "I've been following the Foundation's projects in the news. The education initiative in Kenya sounds remarkable." William's eyes lit up as he described the program's development and impact. Catherine listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and recognizing in his passion the same qualities that had originally drawn her to him. But she also recognized something else. This was the conversation of two colleagues sharing professional interests, not the intimate exchange of romantic partners. "What about you?" William asked. "I know your mother's treatment was successful, but what have you been doing for yourself during all this time?" Catherine described her work with the family support program, her language studies, the friendships she had formed with people from dozens of different countries, and the surprising discovery that she had talents she had never had the opportunity to develop. "Actually," she said, "I've been offered a position running an international program there. I haven't decided whether to take it, but the work has been more fulfilling than anything I've ever done." William leaned back in his chair and studied her face with obvious admiration. "Catherine, that's extraordinary. You should absolutely take the position if it feels right to you, even if it means staying in Switzerland indefinitely. Especially if it means that you found work that uses your gifts in service of something meaningful. That's incredibly rare and valuable." They talked for 2 hours, covering everything from family updates to travel experiences to professional challenges. The conversation flowed easily, but Catherine gradually became aware that they were talking like close friends who had shared an important history, not like former lovers considering reunion. When William mentioned Sarah Mitchell's work coordinating the Foundation's African programs, Catherine heard genuine affection and respect in his voice. When he described a recent trip they had taken together to visit project sites, she understood without being told that their relationship had evolved beyond professional collaboration. "Are you happy?" Catherine asked directly, in the spirit of the honesty they had always shared with each other. William considered the question seriously. "Yes, I am. I'm doing work I believe in, with people I respect and care about. I'm building something that feels sustainable and meaningful. It's not the life I thought I wanted 3 years ago, but it's a good life." Catherine felt a profound sense of relief and happiness for him. "I'm so glad, William. You deserve that kind of fulfillment. What about you? Are you happy?" "I am," Catherine said, surprised by how true it felt. "I'm happy in ways I didn't know were possible. I miss England sometimes, and I miss the people I love here, but I've also discovered that I can create meaning and connection anywhere if I'm willing to open myself to new experiences." They walked together after coffee, following familiar streets, but with the relaxed pace of people who weren't trying to recapture the past or force a particular future. Near the park where they had once spent so much time together, William stopped and turned to face Catherine. "I want to say something, and I hope you'll hear it the way I mean it," he said. "Loving you was one of the best things that ever happened to me, not just because of how happy we were together, but because of what that relationship taught me about my own capacity for commitment and growth. I'm a better person because of what we shared, and I carry that with me in everything I do." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of gratitude rather than sadness. "I feel exactly the same way. What we had was real and important and beautiful, and it prepared both of us for the lives we're building now." They hugged goodbye in front of the park, and this time the embrace lasted longer, carrying the weight of everything they had been to each other and everything they would always mean to each other, even as they moved forward separately. "Will I see you again before you decide about Switzerland?" William asked. "I'm sure we will. And whatever I decide, I hope we'll stay in touch. I'd like to hear about your work, and I'd like you to know about mine." "I'd like that too." Catherine walked home feeling lighter than she had in months. The meeting with William had answered questions she hadn't even known she was carrying. There was no unfinished business between them, no wondering about what might have been, no sense that either of them was settling for something less than they truly wanted. They had loved each other completely, said goodbye with grace, and grown into people who could appreciate what they had shared without needing to recreate it. That felt like the best possible ending to their romantic story, and the best possible beginning for their ongoing friendship. That evening, Catherine called Dr. Weber in Switzerland. Andreas? It's Catherine Sterling. I've made my decision about the position. If the offer still stands, I'd like to accept it. Catherine, that's wonderful news. What helped you decide? Catherine looked around her childhood bedroom, thinking about the life she had built in Switzerland, the work that had given her such profound purpose, and the person she had become when freed from familiar patterns and expectations. I realized that home isn't necessarily where you come from, she said. Sometimes it's where you discover who you're meant to be. 3 months later, Catherine stood in her new office at the medical facility in Switzerland, looking at a wall covered with thank you letters from families she had helped and photos from staff retreats where colleagues had become close friends. Her mother's health remained excellent, and her parents had begun making regular trips to visit Catherine and explore the opportunities for expanding their charitable work in Europe. Marcus had enrolled at the University of Geneva and was thriving in his studies and his growing fluency in multiple languages. Catherine had received a card the week before from William and Sarah announcing their engagement and expressing their hope that she would be able to attend their wedding the following summer. The invitation had filled her with genuine joy and a deep sense of rightness about the way their lives had unfolded. She had found her place in the world not by holding on to the past, but by having the courage to let go of what was beautiful but finished in order to discover what was beautiful and just beginning. The goodbye that had once felt like an ending had turned out to be the beginning of exactly the life she was meant to live. Sometimes, Catherine reflected, the most loving thing you can do is let someone go completely so that you can both become who you're supposed to be. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, that process of letting go leads you to discover that you're stronger, more capable, and more at home in the world than you ever imagined possible. The pain of that wordless goodbye had been real and profound, but it had also been the price of entry into lives that neither she nor William could have built while holding on to what they had been to each other. In the end, their love story had a perfect ending, not because they stayed together, but because they loved each other enough to grow apart with grace, carrying the best of what they had shared into separate futures that honored what they had learned about love, commitment, and the courage required to choose what serves the greater good over what serves only yourself. The Yendi, this is a work of fiction. All characters and events are entirely imaginary and bear no resemblance to real persons or events.